Come on, get out.
Are you going to play the video, Yinda?
Can you guys hear me with Bluetooth headphones?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I want to welcome you to my book launch and introduce you to Aziza Kanji, who's going to moderate tonight.
Thank you, AJ, and hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the launch of AJ Withers' new book, Fight to Win, Inside everyone else who is speaking at the story of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, with the most recent treaty holders being the Mississaugas of New Credit First Nation. This land is also the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, a covenant between Indigenous nations to share and care for the land. Across this country that currently calls itself Canada, Indigenous land and water defenders continue to confront some of the sharpest edges of state violence in resistance to colonial corporate depredations on their lands, as the world has been witnessing in recent weeks with the RCMP military police assault on the Wet'suwet'en people. We honor and salute their resistance, and we remember that the ongoing colonial assault against Indigenous lives, lands, and laws continues to lie at the very foundations of the depredations of colonialism and property and capitalism that are the subject of the resistance to which A.J. Withers discusses in their beautiful book, Fight to Win, that we are here to launch tonight. Fight to Win is not only a valuable guide for resistance and struggles in the present, it also participates in the vital act of writing a radical history of the present for the future, in resistance to the persistent efforts of systems of power to reclaim and rewrite these histories for themselves in order to bolster their own power, to represent progress as the product of their own genius and benevolence. So thank you so much, AJ, for this beautiful book. And thank you to all of us, or to everyone who is here today to help launch this book into the world in a beautiful way. For the program tonight, we are going to start with some brief comment from author A.J. Withers, and then we will be hearing from our esteemed speakers, John Clark, Jennifer Jewell, and Desmond Cole, and then some longer comments from A.J., and then we're going to move to discussion with all of you who are here with us tonight. So please, as we go through the event, please continue to put your comments and any questions you have for the Q&A into the YouTube chat. We will be compiling them and then we will come back to them in the discussion. And I would also ask, please, that you engage in this discussion and in this event tonight in the spirit of love that informs all of the work and the activism that we are discussing here today. In other words, please refrain from making any sexist, racist, homophobic, or transphobic comments. Those won't be given any space in the chat. And so without any further ado, I now turn to author of Fight to Win, A.J. Withers, for some brief introductory remarks. A.J. is the author of Fight to Win and has organized with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, whose activism is the subject of Fight to Win for about 20 years. They are also the author of Disability Politics and Theory and A Violent History of Benevolence, Interlocking Oppression in the Moral Economies of Social Working, co-authored with Professor Chris Chapman. And AJ is also co-founder of factcheckedtoronto.ca, and all of these are such vital resources for countering much of the state propaganda that we see around poverty and bolstering systems of capitalism in Canada. Fact Check Toronto being a very important guide to debunking state claims about homelessness in Toronto, Violent History of Benevolence, taking a broader look against these narratives of benevolence that sustain state systems of power and oppression. So thank you for this work, AJ. Thank you for this current book, and we'll turn to you for some initial remarks.
Thank you so much, Aziza, for that introduction and for being here tonight. And I want to thank John and Jennifer and Desmond for joining us, as well as everyone from Fernwood and Another Story Books, and everyone watching at home and hopefully participating in the conversation. This book took me where I did not expect to go. It took me to a really deep understanding of housing first as a tool for pathologization, criminalization, and as a neoliberal tactic. It fundamentally changed my understanding of organizing, of how and when we win, and how the state operates. And I write a lot in it about how activists produce knowledge collectively. And this book wouldn't have been possible without that collective knowledge production and with the collective organizing of people in OCAP. And I want to thank OCAP for sort of taking the risk of doing this project with me. And there were especially 5 folks who worked with me as an OCAP committee, reviewing drafts, fighting about politics, and engaging in really rigorous conversations with me. And I just want to shout out to them. One of them is John Clark, and they are also Yogi Acharya, Mark Brill, Danielle Koyama, and Leslie Wood. And I also want to recognize all of the people who supported me through this project. I wrote Fight to Win inside Poor People's Organizing as an organizing tool and as an intervention into homelessness policy. And I hope you enjoyed a night, and I really look forward to the conversations that it sparks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, AJ, for those opening comments. Now we will turn for some remarks from John Clark, who co-founded the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty in 1990 as a radical anti-capitalist alternative to reformist approaches to poverty mitigation. John worked as an organizer for OCAP until his retirement in 2019, and he currently holds the Packer Visitor in Social Justice at York University. John, please.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Aziza. This being a book launch, I suppose I should begin by acknowledging what an actually wonderful book this is. What AJ has put together is something that I think is really important in terms of a record of struggles that have been taken up. If you read some of the accounts of the mobilizing that was done by the unemployed movement in the 1930s, they're very inspiring narratives, but you don't get very much sense of what they actually did and how they did it. But in this book, what you have is a narrative that's very exciting, but you also have a clear understanding of how the organizing and the mobilizing has taken place. And you have on top of that, an analysis, some political analysis of what has taken place that is incredibly insightful and incredibly important. And through all that is expressed through the fact that AJ is actually a comrade that was involved in the struggles, was a major activist playing a major part in those struggles. So it's an incredibly useful book. I would say something that's really rare and really, really important in that regard. And of course, we live in a society that really doesn't appreciate resistance, really doesn't appreciate people challenging oppression, people challenging exploitation, people challenging social abandonment. And if they don't like that, they don't like a clear record of how people have resisted. And that's what we have here that's so incredibly important. Over the years, OCAP has been, I would say, an unapologetically and deliberately discordant note. We were formed in 1990, and we've challenged an agenda of mounting austerity and poverty over that entire period. And we've taken up the slogan of Fight to Win, and it's entirely appropriate that be incorporated into the title of this incredible book. We've taken up the title of Fight to Win, but it's clear that we've advanced that slogan at a time when there wasn't nearly enough winning going on. When in fact the regressive agenda has been gaining ground, and some of the ways in which we've engaged and tried to make a difference and tried to win concrete victories really comes out very, very clearly in this book. I think this book is something that those who feel pessimistic, those who feel despondent, those who feel doubtful should read and get some real inspiration and hope from as well. We've won things in an unfavorable context, and we've made a difference in people's lives. That's certainly true. All the people who were being abandoned, all the people who were being crushed, who were uplifted in a struggle and participated in a struggle to change things and makes a difference. And that comes through clearly in this book. We made a difference in the lockdown, I think, is we've created a model of resistance that's of enormous perspective. And I think really and truly the most important point to put forward of all, that this book comes out now at such an important time. As we speak, if we believe the G7 leaders, they're about to build back better. But I don't see a lot of evidence of that. I see people in homeless encampments in this city being dispersed by the police. I see employers on the offensive. I see, in the middle of a disastrous climate episode, the RCMP raiding the land defenders in BC. I see a system that's on the attack, and under conditions of incredible societal crisis. And models of resistance, I think, in this situation are incredibly important. I'm by no means suggesting that OCAP is the definitive model. We see inspiring struggles breaking out everywhere. The Black Lives Matter mobilization that followed the murder of George Floyd was the largest social mobilization, many say, in US social movement history. We see the Indian farmers winning this incredible victory against Modi. And of course, we see the unbeatable resistance of the Palestinians continuing. These things are happening. But what's really, really important is to build clear models of how people can organize and how people can move forward. And right here in Toronto, I believe that OCAP has made a contribution to establishing that kind of model. A model that can make a real difference, a model that uses the methods of disruptive collective action in tactically and strategically smart and informed ways, informed by an overall anti-capitalist politics. That's what OCAP has been about, and I think that's what this book captures and points to so clearly and in such an important way. So it's a marvelous book. I hope people will use it. It's in that sense, a scholarly work. In that sense, there's a lot to learn from it. People would be very interested. It would make a very interesting thing to read. But more than anything, it's a handbook for resistance. And that's the great contribution that I thank AJ for making. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, John, for putting this handbook for resistance in the context and in relationship with all of these other beautiful struggles that are ongoing right now, the models that we can learn from those in relationship with the histories of resistance that AJ has laid out. And thank you also for reminding us that we shouldn't lose faith that a scholarly book can also be exciting and useful. So thank you, John, and thank you, AJ, again, for your beautiful work that has inspired John's comments. Now we will turn to Jennifer Jewell, who is a queer disabled activist living in a shelter hotel, fighting the City of Toronto for better conditions in the shelter system and to stop the criminalization of unhoused people. Jennifer, your comments, please.
Hi, my name is Jennifer. I am a 51-year-old elder queer and activist. I'm here to speak about my personal experiences as they relate to the systemic issues outlined by AJ in their book, Fight to Win. AJ writes about the politics in place and the mechanics our government employ to keep us down. I will be talking about the ongoing detrimental effects it has meant for my life and health, and I'm also going to share something a friend of mine wrote about her experiences as a single Black mom living in poverty afterwards. I was evicted from my housing of 20 years when my landlord became ill and was forced to retire. His family took over, and the evictions began less than a year later at the beginning of the pandemic. I was the first to be evicted, with the rest of the tenants being kicked out with the LTB's blessing in the following months. I have been homeless ever since. None of the trauma I've lived through since would have happened if ODSP provided a livable income, if my name had come up in the last 15 years of waiting for housing. I spent the first 8 months couch surfing in unsafe environments. I was physically assaulted in the first and thrown out of the second over a conflict. Her perception of what disability was did not reflect my reality. In 1998, the maximum shelter allowance for ODSP was $416 a month. It is now 23 years later, and that amount has only been raised to $497. That is a difference of $81 split over 23 years. Where, in the city of Toronto, can I find a fully wheelchair-accessible apartment or any housing for $497 a month? I have chronic health issues and allergies which prevent me from living in shared spaces. I need a space large enough that I can move around any furniture with my walker, including my bed. One of the spaces the city of Toronto showed me was so small that my wheelchair actually became wedged in the space between the bedroom and the bathroom and the closet. And to them, they don't see that as a problem. I kind of do. Some of you are familiar with my story and the details surrounding me being left behind in a fire. I'm still traumatized by what happened. There was so much smoke in my room that I genuinely thought I was going to die. I was left behind when every other resident on my floor was evacuated because I couldn't come down 14 flights of stairs. For weeks, I had nightmares of burning to death every night. When the fire alarm goes off at the shelter, I still freak out, sometimes for hours. Sometimes I'm okay, and other times I'm just not. And I'm still in therapy. The city worker who's relaying offers to my housing worker is aware of this and knows that I refuse to move anywhere where I can't be evacuated safely along with my chair. His response was that as far as the city of Toronto was concerned, anything on the 9th floor and lower is considered accessible. My second to last apartment was on the 7th floor of a building. The elevators broke frequently. One time I was running errands and ended up having to spend the weekend at a friend's house without access to my medication because that's how long it took to fix the elevator. Toronto housing is old, it's not properly maintained, and they are millions of dollars behind in repairs. Their elevators break. So what am I going to do if I live on the 9th floor of a building and I'm unable to get back home because the elevators are broken? And where am I going to go? Disabled people across the city are being forced into untenable living situations because the city refuses to accommodate them, and financially speaking, we have very few options. They do not have the luxury of being housed. Sorry, I apologize. We do not have the luxury of being housed near our medical supports or communities or the friends that we depend on to help out. Home care agencies are one of those medical supports that is location specific. Please feel free to ask me about the importance of this later. There are currently 80,000 people on the waiting list for subsidized housing. How many of those people are disabled and living in spaces that are inaccessible or downright unsafe? People, disabled or not, deserve to live somewhere where they can have access to their supports and can have quality of life. Adequate. The City of Toronto's process for housing people does not allow for personal autonomy. It does not allow for disability. It does not allow for community. The City of Toronto itself has slowly been chipping away at those things that I literally need to survive because they see them as optional. I spent the first 15 of 20 years living in a second-story apartment where I spent 24 to 27 days a month unable to go out because there were 18 steps between me and the first floor. I will never, ever live in that situation again, which is why I'm homeless. 10 years ago, I wouldn't have fought for my rights around housing, but enough is enough. I have been living with chronic illness and physical disability for the last 29 years of my life. I spent 20 of those waiting for housing, the last 15 of which have been for buildings within proximity to my specific medical supports. All of those years were spent living in apartments that were physically inaccessible, which made getting a wheelchair impossible. And my wheelchair, she's my freedom. Without the money to pay rent, my situation and those like me will never change. We will continue to deteriorate in physical and mental health until we are no longer able to survive it. Some of my friends haven't, which is what the government wants. Homelessness is a policy choice. Studies have shown that it is much more economically sustainable to just house people. It's better for the economy, it's better for our health. There are so many benefits in being housed that many take for granted. Instead of living in a home where I can heal, create art, and be a safe space for others, I am living in a shelter hotel with my friends dying around me, being denied basic accommodations around disability, where I spent the last 12 months waiting for housing that doesn't exist. Thank you. These are my friends' words. I remember saving money for my first apartment. My children were 4 and 5 years old. I was proud to get my key. I asked one of the tenants in the hallway if the place was good, and she said no. I moved in, but heeded her warning. My 2-bedroom apartment was humble. In 1995, it cost me $730 plus hydro, considered on the cheaper side back then. The 2-bedroom was spacious, but had almost no soundproofing, so when my kids walked around, the neighbors could hear it. It had full-on south-facing windows with no shelter from the sun. It also had a huge roach problem. When the lights went out, it was like a nightmare. The rent increased the next year, and I didn't have enough to make it work. I was happy to leave. I didn't renew my lease. Finding an apartment as a young Black single mom was not a joke. I was told, yes, it's available on the phone, but it's taken when I arrived. I was denied apartments for being on welfare, which is now called OW. I found my second apartment, a store. It was clean and quiet, convenient, and affordable. It had a barely there living room and a tiny kitchen. It was clean and quiet. We were happy with it. And then one day I got a knock on the door and I was told that the apartment was being illegally rented out to me and that I had to move out. So I did. I had to uproot my children yet again. This time it was with an elderly lady. She was friendly, loved to cook, but she had a drinking problem and was mixing it with her assorted medications. Concerned for our safety, I needed to leave in a hurry. I spoke to her about it, and she in turn called the Children's Aid Society on me out of spite. They came in, and everything was fine, but that proves how urgently I needed to get out of there. I talked to the landlord so I could break my end of the lease. I called her to get my stuff back, and she bolted the door. Luckily, I was able to get in. That was the last I saw or heard of her. I had nowhere to go, so I moved back in with family, sharing a room with my children while waiting for affordable housing. We remained there for a few years. With so many of us crammed in a 2-bedroom apartment, things didn't go well. One day I ended up in a shelter with my children. Being in a shelter was the most terrifying choice I've had to make in my life. We were homeless. I had no idea what would happen to us. We were treated well. We had one room, a crib for my baby. I had a third child by then and a large bed for us to share. After a few weeks, I was told there was a market rent apartment in Hamilton for me to check out. It was nice, cheaper than Toronto. I took the apartment in a new city, new schools for the kids again. I went to a couple food banks regularly because after paying rent and juggling bills, there wasn't much left for food. After a few months of staying in Hamilton, my name finally came up for affordable housing. I had been on the list for close to a decade. My children were teens by then. Several schools and homes later, finally, I was able to give them a stable location where I've remained until now. It wasn't smooth sailing. Our home was constantly in need of repairs. My ceiling caved in where the bathtub was. There was electrical and mold issues. I became seriously ill and am, to this day. I've developed mobility issues, anxiety, panic attacks, depression, fibromyalgia, skin problems. I can only afford the 3-bedroom apartment that I'm in because of affordable rent, or I would be forced to uproot again and live out of town away from everyone and community support systems. My family, are paying the price of the trauma of being poor, trauma of my children being treated as less than for living in housing, the assumption that I am lazy and don't want to work, the assumption that they're bad kids simply because of where they live, the assumption that I'm worth less because I'm a single parent who is poor. Through all of this, I was going to school, working, staying home, raising children while being beat down by a system that was designed for us to fail. I'm in neighborhoods where the life expectancy of youth is less than 25 years old. Currently, I am working remotely, which is all I can do with my health issues. So things are a bit more comfortable now, but I'll never forget what I have been through and what others like myself are going through right now. It will forever be etched in my memory. Thanks for listening. But if you are listening, please do whatever it takes to give people the dignity of having a decent roof over their head and enough food to eat. We can work towards doing better right now.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for sharing your experiences and the experiences of your friend, which testify to the everyday violences and injustices inflicted by this system, which parades as being the model of humanity and justice and coexistence. So thank you for that, and thank you also for all the work that you do to expose and fight these depredations. So now we're going to move to a message from Desmond Cole, who unfortunately cannot be with us here in person tonight, but is very much here with us in spirit and has sent a video for us to play. Desmond is the author of the The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power. He is also a journalist and co-creator with the poet and activist Elle Jones of the website Yes Everything, www.yeseverything.ca, the premise of which is the centrality of racism to so many of the systems of oppression that mark this state that we live in. Desmond is a longtime social justice activist, including on Black liberation, police abolition, and homelessness advocacy. So we'll show the video from Desmond, and then after that, we'll return back to AJ for AJ to make their longer comments about the book, and then we'll have the Q&A. So the video by Desmond, please.
Good evening, everyone. One thing I remember very well about meeting a man named Chris many years ago was that he made me tea. He had a little stove in the makeshift home he'd built for himself under the Gardiner Expressway, and he boiled the water and made us both tea. He told me how he'd been staying there despite pressure from city workers and the cops, how he'd bought a generator with his own money, despite the fact that he knew how to access electricity nearby. Looking for coins, and how you'd be surprised how much money you could find that way. How he'd built his home under the highway using scraps of discarded lumber. The word the evening I met Chris was that the police were coming soon to raid the place and to arrest him for trespassing. So several of his friends and several people from the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty camped with Chris that night and waited. I couldn't sleep over, but I promised to come back in the morning. And I did. And the cops came, horses and all. And a lot of us got our asses handed to us for blocking their path. A cop used his horse to rear-end me into a fence, and the giant beast almost trampled on my lower leg. Chris and several others were arrested, only to be released a few hours later. That was in August of 2006. At the time, I didn't know much about OCAP, about how the group organized. I knew them by name and by reputation. I knew that a lot of people in respectable circles hated the group, and it wasn't really hard to see why. I couldn't have imagined then that AJ Withers, who I didn't know at the time, would write a book overly frustrated by the ways that our liberation work is being undermined. They remind us that those in power have extremely organized and strategic ways of trying to unsettle and scatter us, and that we must be just as organized and strategic in fighting back. That we can name and classify the tactics used against us as a way of understanding and combating them. I also appreciate Withers' larger analysis of capitalism and colonialism, and of neoliberalism, all of which are essential in understanding how we got here and why poverty remains so entrenched. Yes, we must fight to win. Withers remarks at the end of the book that, quote, "What OCAP won during the period about which I write seems insignificant compared to what we need to win," end of quote. Fair enough. And the struggle for housing, food, water, access to services, income, safety, dignity, and care is not OCAP's alone. How then do we proceed? I'd like to share two things that I've seen recently that have inspired me. First of all, the organizing and teachings of the last 18 months have completely changed many people in the public's understanding of policing. What it is, what it isn't, what its limitations are, and why we are calling for the defunding and abolition of modern policing. This work must continue, and we must not allow the performative gestures of our politicians, including Mayor John Tory and Toronto City Council, to distract from the urgent need for real change. The fight is not simply against the military-style evictions that we witnessed by the police this summer in our parks, but also against social attitudes that create the desire for civilians to police and control and displace people that they would rather not see. Second, I think of an incredible event held last summer in 2020 by people living in Moss Park with the support of the Encampment Support Network. After a large rally in the park, we marched along Queen Street East to a set of vacant properties that could be used to house people sleeping in Moss Park so that they can remain in the neighborhood. Organizers projected videos of encampment residents speaking about their circumstances onto the walls of the vacant properties. And we got to imagine for a moment a different city. One that uses space that is currently reserved for a few for the needs of those who have been pushed out or ignored. We need more organizing that centers the voices, needs, and desires of poor people. We must project a future that can exist if we choose to fight for it. I say this not only as someone who has admired many of OCAP's works over the years, but as somebody who has benefited from them also. For most of the 2 years leading up to that raid of Chris's place under the Gardiner, I was homeless. Reading this book resurfaced a lot of memories. My first stay at a shelter in Seton House, on a top bunk with a thin white sheet and a cream-colored blanket pulled up to my chin. The nights smoking in the bathroom at the YMCA shelter on Queen Street West because I couldn't sleep. A rally on that same street against the proposed closure of a detox center. The laneways on the north and south of that same street, which were more private and yet more perilous. The winter I finally got my first apartment in Toronto with a stranger I'd met at the shelter, when we found an old wooden entertainment center for our TV and pushed it up the hill in Scarborough towards our place. The fear in that same apartment later on, every time I heard the neighbor turn their key in the door, after I could no longer afford my rent, fearing that it would be the landlord coming to collect. The people squeegeeing downtown at Queen and Spadina for change. The McDonald's on that same corner that sometimes refused to serve those people. The same McDonald's where Snoop Dogg and his entourage came when he was on tour in the city. The things that I experienced formed my journalism and my activism, but long before I could describe or make much sense of much of the things that I was living, people like AJ were organizing and teaching and taking risks for a future that I would then step into. So as I said before, I am extremely grateful to be here. AJ, thank you so much for this book. Congratulations on its publication. And let's keep fighting until we win. Thank you.
I think the video by Desmond is over. I'm sorry we can't actually see it or hear it. But thank you so much, Desmond, for that message. Just a reminder to everyone who's out there watching to please continue engaging in the discussion. Put any questions you have for the Q&A into the chat, and we'll get to them as soon as we have heard from author AJ Withers. I introduced AJ before, and so I won't go through the introduction again, but I'll just turn it over right to AJ so we can hear from the brilliant mind that has produced this brilliant book. Thanks, AJ. And your mic is
Classic. Sorry. Thank you so much, Aziza, and thanks to Desmond. I'm going to read a few little sections from the book, and then I'll say a couple of things. On July 13th, 2017, OCAP organizer Yogi Acharya answered a call in the OCAP office from someone named Neil, who said that he was being harassed by private security in a public park. The security guard had been hired by the St. Lawrence Market Neighborhood Business Improvement Area, BIA, to remove people from the neighborhood whom it deemed were breaking the rules. At the center of the BIA's social cleansing efforts was St. James Park. Neil's phone call would spark a brief campaign by OCAP against private securitization and displacement of homeless people. St. James Park, like all of what's now called Toronto, is on the traditional territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabeg, and Haudenosaunee. The Gaswenta, or two-row wampum, is the first treaty between Europeans and Indigenous nations in North America. It is the foundational treaty, after which all other treaties have been made and symbolize the autonomy of and mutual respect between Indigenous and settler nations. It marks the necessity of both non-interference and relationship building. These principles are repeatedly disregarded by Canada and Canadians, which has resulted in colonialism, past and present, including continued land dispossession. St. James Park is in the southern portion of Toronto's downtown East End. It's a 10 to 15-minute walk from Toronto's financial district and surrounded by both fancy and fast food restaurants, tourists, new condos, and rental housing. The area is also a hub of social services and agencies that poor and homeless people rely on. St. James Park is just south of the Salvation Army Gateway Men's Homeless Shelter and Drop-In, which shelters up to 120 men pre-pandemic. This is where Neil had been staying when he called us on his phone from the park. When Yogi answered the call in the office, Neil implored OCAP to immediately do something about the harassment. I could hear Neil's voice through the phone and could tell he was both angry and distressed. I'm only sitting there doing a puzzle, Neil later said. The security guard just wants to try very much to intimidate you. He stands, he pumps his chest up. He starts putting on his leather gloves. He totally tries to intimidate everybody. And most people, when they're homeless, they fall into that. They do feel threatened, Neil said. Neil saw no reason why he should have to leave the gazebo or the park. So first he called a friend to tell him that he might need bail money, and then he called OCAP. While Yogi was on the phone with Neil, I called the St. Lawrence Market Neighborhood BIA. A few minutes later, I got a call from someone at the BIA. He told me that some of the vagrants are mean-spirited, that they swear and yell. He said that many of them are nice enough, and tried to explain that the BIA wasn't out to clear the park of all the vagrants, just the ones that the BIA deemed undesirable. BIAs are created through city legislation and are officially called business improvement areas, but they're often referred to by most people as BIAs or business improvement associations. While the BIA model, or some variation of it, has spread around the world, it began in Toronto in the early 1970s. BIAs are funded by the city through a levy on businesses as part of municipal taxes. One of the visible outcomes of BIA's labor are aesthetics specific to each neighborhood's major streets. Matching streetlights or flower pots, sometimes directly branded with the local BIA's name, help build neighborhood cohesion. They can also be involved in security, urban planning, and social policy. Neil wanted to fight back against the harassment of the homeless people in the park by the BIA hired security. For St. James Park to be made into public space on public land, private land had to be created. This construction was and remains an integral part of the colonial project. Indeed, the concept of private land ownership was a colonial import. Lands were wrested away from being collectively shared and cared for by Indigenous people in order to create both private and public lands in what is now called Toronto. While public space is supposed to be open to everyone, in the Canadian settler state, public space is already predicated, at least historically, on the understanding that some people are not persons. From my own observations in the park and from steady statistics, these people are disproportionately Indigenous. This isn't coincidence, nor is it irony. It's the ongoing work of colonialism. From OCAP's perspective, as gentrification occurs, the pressure increases on poor people to leave neighborhoods they have been lived in for years. Gentrification redefines the types of public behavior deemed acceptable, what Patillo describes as progressive criminalization of quality of life issues. Middle and upper class people often have different sensibilities and come into conflicts over the use of shared spaces with poor residents, some of whom have been in the neighborhood for years. These conflicts do not result in higher crime levels, but may create the appearance of increased crime due to increased police response. A city councilor staffer described the way that middle and upper class people expressed their disdain for poor and homeless people in a gentrifying neighborhood. Quote, "They discussed how we make the space welcoming to everyone. That's the language that they use frequently. So it's this weird kind of sidestepping of being out and out awful about homeless people and poor people and focusing on how do we make the space for everyone. Coded," end quote. This coded language doesn't come out and say we don't want poor and homeless people here, but works at the level of implication. And the staffer told me after a meeting with such discourse that they had removed several benches from St. James Park. If homeless people are vanished from a welcoming for everyone rhetoric, the question then arises, who is everyone? Homeless people are included as excluded in the neoliberal city. Full citizenship is dependent on consumption and production within the capitalist economy. The citizenship on the margins that homeless people occupy means that a park can be made welcoming for everyone through the practice of unwelcoming of homeless people. The rise of the neoliberal city has also featured the privatization and regulation, the decline of public space. The St. Lawrence Market BIA worked to increase the regulation of and partially privatize St. James Park by hiring a private security guard to patrol the park several hours a day, 6 days a week. The security guard, Santo, said that the BIA, quote, hired private security to patrol their properties and enforce the rules and regulations. Here it seems that the BIA views the park as their property. Only certain kinds of rules and regulations were deemed important to enforce, and they were only enforced against certain kinds of people. Al Smith, executive director of the BIA, claimed, quote, "We do not target poor people. We're simply hoping to make the area safe," end quote. However, from what the people in the park told us, every situation they described was someone who looked poor or was homeless being singled out. How is someone sleeping a safety threat to others? Or drinking? Perhaps Smith believed that the security guard wasn't targeting poor people specifically. However, the BIA was working to produce poor and homeless people as inherent threats. This enabled the BIA to produce a problem, create the need for a safety intervention, legitimize that safety intervention through their own discourses, and then work to solve the problem. But we solved the problem. OCAP solved the problem. Neil had the idea of making Know Your Rights posters, which I'm going to try and show you. Maybe I can't. Here we go. Can you see the posters? Great. He had the idea of putting up Know Your Rights posters around the park, and it empowered park users to resist the securitization of the park, to resist the security guard. Using Homer Simpson really leveled the security guard and was able to kind of help people make fun of him. At the same time, we pushed against the city bureaucrats and the counselor. And there's a video on YouTube called Back Off BIA that you can watch that we used as part of the campaign. We won. No more illegal security guards in the park. That was 2017. And this is this summer. This is a picture of a park this year. It was full of private security guards working with the cops in an operation to violently evict encampment residents. These security guards were privately policing a public park fully legally. Why? Because the city hired them. A single private security company was paid $22.5 million to police unhoused people for a 9-month period. For some perspective, the city's 27 funded drop-ins, which provide food and other services and supplies, get about $5.6 million for the same period. So it's about $340 a month per unhoused person for parapolice, and about $3 per unhoused person for each drop-in. The money for this one security company is, of course, on top of the over $1 billion budget for the police, so much of which is directed towards targeting unhoused people, the majority of whom are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And the book tells the story of this quick campaign that we won. And a few years later, what we had defeated has been institutionalized by ruling relations. And the book tells other stories of campaigns that we won or that we partially won. And here too, overall, people's lives have continued to get worse. And this is just where we are. Electoral victories won't change the fact that there's a tsunami of misery coming down on poor and homeless communities that are largely Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and that are disproportionately queer and trans, disproportionately disabled. And the tsunami is not new. The devastation of this tsunami comes through relentless bombarding waves. And this tsunami has a name. Its name is capitalism. Its name is colonialism. And now with the climate crisis that's a direct consequence of it, we will see the dispossession of even more people, especially people of color, especially poor people, especially people in the global South. So I fought against this tsunami for a long time. And as part of OCAP, we have won. I calculate in the book that OCAP has won over $3 billion for poor people. And I think more importantly, that we have shown people that they can come together and they can fight back and they can win. So OCAP can win $3 billion, but that can happen in every town and in every city across the planet. But the waves keep coming. And we have lost more than we have won. And it is very easy to slide into a neoliberal nostalgia and just long for better days when things were slightly less worse. And so when I talk about losing, I think it's important to recognize what I'm talking about. It's public space, it's beds, it's income, but it's also real people. It's people that we love, and it's people that deserved so much more. And so this is where my tsunami metaphor comes to an end, because tsunamis are natural and unstoppable forces, and capitalism and colonialism are the actions of human beings, homelessness and poverty, two of their consequences. And we can fight back, we can take it back, we can decolonize. In the book, I try to map out real organizing lessons from OCAP, how to identify and combat demobilization tactics, like Desmond was talking about, how to deal with fake grassroots organizations, what I call SOD organizations, that are aligned with ruling relations, and how to actually assess what is working. But the one lesson that I'll leave you with tonight is an amalgam of a Black Panther slogan and an OCAP slogan. The Panthers is build to win. We have to build the just world that we need, and we have to build movements big enough to get us there, and most importantly, to keep it. And the OCAP slogan, Fight to Win, is the title of this book for good reason, like John was talking about. Registering our dissent is futile. Organizing is not about group therapy. It's about winning real material gains. These aren't times to perform resistance. These are times to resist, to win. Things feel really dire right now, and that's because they are. There's only one option, and it's to win. Build to win, to fight to win. Thank you.
Thank you so much, AJ, for that powerful and incisive analysis of ruling regimes, of their capacity to continually reinvent and reassert themselves, of the stakes of the struggles that we are waging right now. But thank you also for showing us within those ruling regimes of power where those points are of penetration, where resistance can actually insert itself into the ruling regimes and perhaps thwart or reconfigure themselves even in some small way. And thank you also for showing us perhaps the most radical act that Homer Simpson has ever been a part of, even if it was against his will. So thank you for showing us that anything can be turned into a tool of resistance when it's in the right hands. So everyone, please continue sending in your questions in the Q&A. We have one right here. Is it important to get the quote unquote public on side to make gains in the fight against poverty? And to that, maybe I would also add, who is this public and how do we conceive of the public? And is reconceptualizing colonial notions of the public or the nation also part of this struggle that we are waging? So whoever wants to weigh in first on that.
Well, if nobody's going to, I can't resist that one. I mean, first of all, yes, I mean, these are absolutely right to say who is the public. There isn't just this. I mean, I don't think we're going to win too many hearts and minds on Bay Street, and nor should we try. On the contrary, we need to fight these people. The public is a very nebulous concept, possible number of working class people. But I also think that really and truly, we make a mistake if we think that those in political power are sitting around saying to themselves, oh, what are the polls saying? What is the public thinking? Or we better do what they tell us. There's lots of opinion surveys that show that, in fact, people are appalled by the homeless crisis. There's lots of opinion surveys that show that people think the banks and the corporations should be paying more taxes. But I don't see the governments rushing to fulfill the will of the people on any of those things. Because the reality is that, I'll be blunt, if we could have a situation in terms of the kind of work that's happened in OCAP, if we could have a choice between having 70% of people prepared to tell Angus Reid that they sympathise with us, or 10% of people out on the streets joining us, I'd go with the 10%. The question is, change is made through people struggling. And in the course of struggling, that struggle creates its own public opinion, its own majority. So I don't think we should be, I'm not suggesting deliberately calculated unpopularity, but what I am suggesting is that the struggle is the thing that defines. And we need to take up that struggle. And in doing that, I have no doubt that we'll win a majority. I just saw an ECOS poll. I don't follow polls that closely. I just saw an ECOS poll that said that 70% of people at the beginning of the pandemic were saying that fundamental changes were needed in Canadian society. People are not by any means as conservative as you think if a lead is given, and that's the issue. And that's what AJ's book is all about, giving that kind of lead to people.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I think that we need people on side, like John said, and which people is really important. But that the thing that poor people have is numbers. Like poor folks don't have a lot of resources. People with power have a lot of resources. And so poor folks coming together is where their power lies. And so the more people coming together, the more disruptive they can be, and the more power they can create and grow. And I think that there is a tremendous amount of discourse trying to put forward this argument to get people to soften their tactics, to bring the public on side, like people aren't ready for that, et cetera, et cetera. And that is a major trap that is only designed to get people to stop resisting, or to take things slower, and to blame backlashes against really legitimate resistances against very real grievances on the victims of oppression, instead of the people that are causing the backlash, instead of the people in power. So I think instead of talking about like the public, thinking about how diverse the public is and who we really need to have be on our side, and how do we get those people engaged and active, rather than, like John said, people on Bay Street.
Also, I mean, we know when we look throughout history that struggles which are now, upheld and valorized, for example, MLK Jr.'s tactics, which are now positioned as this nonviolent, quote unquote, good alternative to the more radical activism of groups now like BLM, or the more radical activism of figures in the past like Malcolm X. We know that even those tactics were fundamentally opposed by large portions of the public at the time, who saw them as too radical, as too disruptive. And yet now those histories are co-opted by ruling powers to say, well, why can't you just be more gentle and nonviolent like MLK Jr. was? And so, going back to the question of writing histories, reclaiming histories, why it's so important to have the kind of documentation that you lay out, AJ, in your book. Could you all maybe reflect a bit on how the way that we think about and tell the struggles that have preceded us shape the context for the kinds of struggles we can engage in the present and in the future?
For me, I have been really frustrated with the literature that largely comes out of the movement right now, because I find, and I think it's probably the case of what's coming out of contemporary movements for the most part in general, I'm not sure. But I find looking at people writing about their organizing work when they're looking back 20 years is very, very informative for me in terms of learning about organizing. Oftentimes when people are writing about the work that their groups are doing right now, I find it quite superficial, because they're not telling us the details of what they're doing. They're giving us pretty sweeping statements, like John was talking earlier about in the 1930s, that you don't really get an idea of what people are actually doing. And so I stopped really learning. I would learn about the politics of people, but not about the actual organizing work. And so for me, like, the documenting of the actual organizing work is in part about the telling of the history. And I think very differently about correcting the historical record now. Like, there's little things where I'm like, we should have written a letter to the editor and made them do a correction just for the historical record. But which I never would have thought before. But I much more think about, like, what is, like, actually useful for folks like us in terms of learning, in terms of organizing right now, because there's so little that I find that I can really draw from. And, like, the example that I often come to is, like, take direction from directly affected people, of course, and also that is like the most hollow statement that anyone can possibly say. And if you just say that and you just say our group is doing that and therefore we're doing a really good job, that leaves people that are trying to do work, especially new folks, either to feel like complete failures when they learn that that's actually really messy and complicated. It involves long and hard conversations and relationships and learning, or so they either feel like failures or they kind of look to this and do it and don't feel like failures, think they're doing a good job and do it really poorly and aren't reflexive about it. And so I think it leaves a lot of people either not learning or leaving movements. And so actually telling the truth of what's happening instead of producing propaganda is important for the history, but it's really important for learning about organizing right now. And the people that are looking back and telling the histories of movements in the past is how I learn, but I would like to learn it while it's happening.
Thank you, AJ. That leads us, I think, nicely into some questions from Liza Jackson about the centering of people with lived experience in anti-poverty organizing, as well as the difference between worker organizing and unwaged people's organizing, if you perceive a difference. So all of you, Jennifer, John, AJ, if you have any reflections on, as you said, AJ, it's easy to say center the people with lived experience, but in real life that's often much messier and involves many complicated dynamics of oppression that can play out in ways that often aren't captured in the recordings or the textbooks or the stories that we read of resistance and of struggles. So all of you, your reflections on this on the dynamics involved in centering lived experience, people with lived experience, and doing social justice work in a just way.
For me, I think activism needs to be intersectional. I was a political activist. There's me and a small group of friends back in the 90s, early 2000s, and it was just us. There was nobody else. And I was out of it. I quit 20 years ago. I burned out, and I had, my disability stuff. I have someone joining me. And a friend recently, a friend's found him living outside and he needed a home. But one of the things that I've been really glad to see this time around is that things are a lot more intersectional. And I think one of the problems is that people who are not familiar with issues around poverty or homelessness, they see us as a monolith, and we are all individual, like I'm disabled and queer, and so there's issues around that where I'm impacted directly because of those things. And I have friends who are also disabled and queer, who are either trans or women of color, and that that brings more issues to the table, and people have unique needs. And I think there are, larger solutions that would help the majority of us, but then there's these smaller things that often get left behind. And when people are fighting for, the larger overall group of, homeless people, they're forgetting about people that are also dealing with racism or misogyny or ableism. And some communities have been told for such a long time, we'll get to you next. And that goes to what AJ was saying about being, we're supposed to be more polite about it, or we're being too loud about it. We can't be, And I mean, with what happened with how do I pronounce it? Sorry. Recently they were arresting the elders.
At the Wet'suwet'en. Land defenders.
Yeah, and the government went in assault rifles and helicopters, and we're arresting their elders, and that fight's been going on for centuries. And quiet doesn't get it done. And I think the other thing that people within the movement need to realize is that there's so many different approaches, and we need people engaging in all of them. And one of the things I'm grateful for is I'm learning so much from the activists this time around. I really am. And, you know, the generations now that carried on the fight from when we were doing it, there's so much more inclusion there and have opened our eyes to things that never occurred to us. And I'm really grateful for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jennifer. You know, the philosopher Sarah Ahmed talks about how in feminist struggles, for example, non-white women are always relegated to being the others whose liberation and justice is perpetually deferred. And so in our activism, and thank you also for the cameo from your friend. And that also is a reminder that as human animals, liberation and freedom for us is fundamentally intertwined with all of those non-human animals and the non-human creatures whose oppression and injustice is often so intertwined with those of humans who are oppressed precisely because they are dehumanized. So thank you so much for all of that. John, did you have any reflections on the questions? Difference between worker organizing and unwaged people's organizing, and the dynamics of centering people with lived experience in the work.
There's a lot that could be said, but I'll say just one quick thing, I think, which is that one of the situations, when I was introducing some ideas, the first thing I said is that OCAP was organised in a very difficult time, a time when people were getting hammered. And we've put lots of people on the streets, and we've done lots of organising, and we've certainly put down roots in communities and involved large numbers of people in organising. We haven't as yet made the breakthrough to the kind of huge, deep community-based struggles that have taken place at different times and in different places. And but I think we've pointed in that direction, and we've involved people in communities to an enormous degree over the years. I think of, for example, as we struggled to win the special diet benefit for people that probably got at least one of the $3 billion that AJ was talking about back to poor people. The heart and soul of that came from the Somali community, primarily Somali women, who organised relentlessly in ways through a communication system and brought out people and mobilised and shaped that campaign to a degree that was incredible. In the 1930s, when they were resisting evictions, they could mobilise crowds of a couple of thousand people in next to no time through block committees. And that wasn't some organizer sitting in an office who was in control of things. That was people in communities at the base actually doing that kind of organizing. And that's what I think the present situation calls out for. It calls for the kind of model we've tried to build to be expanded and extended enormously, so that coming right down from the depths of communities, you've got levels of participatory, dynamic, democratic forms of organization that really reflect the will of people and really reflect the intentions and the desires of people.
AJ, also, does anyone have any idea what time we're supposed to be?
8:30.
8:30. Okay, so we have 10 more minutes. So AJ, and then we have another question in the chat, and then maybe we'll finish with some general reflections.
Yeah. So I really appreciate what everyone has said so far, and I'll just add, I had a really lovely conversation with someone on the weekend about how how tokenistic taking leadership can be sometimes. And for me, taking leadership is really about relationship building, and that, like what Jennifer was taking about the need for struggles being intersectional, that having strong movements and strong intersectional movements really can mean having good relationships where people build together and teach each other. And one thing that I see happening often, is that people become tokenized and aren't particularly respected, in the sense that people don't call them on things when they do something really problematic, and they're like taking leadership from them, and so they're just like dealing with people fundamentally different than they would anyone else, which is, I think, incredibly disrespectful to that person, rather than building a meaningful relationship where you have somewhere to go in terms of movement building. And I think taking leadership doesn't mean abandoning yourself and what you can bring to a relationship.
Thank you, AJ. We have one more question in the chat from Colin Phillips, who says, with all due respect, I love you, AJ, but you have articulated why I don't feel welcome in OCAP as a socialist, queer, disabled person who is just as comfortable at a demo as I am at Queen's Park. Thoughts?
Well, I guess I would, I don't know exactly what specifically you're referencing, Colin, but I quote your dissertation in my book. And so, you know, if it's someone who I think possibly is referring to my referencing electoral politics, I don't know. But in your dissertation, you talk about Housing First being sort of accidentally neoliberal, and it's okay. And I think it's really important to fundamentally critique electoral politics and how things don't ever end up accidentally neoliberal, that things become, things are really very rarely broken or very rarely accidentally something. The system really is working just fine. My students in social work will often throw their arms up and say, it's broken. And by the end of the term, we'll usually begin to accept that it's actually working as it's designed to work. And Housing First is a neoliberal program that was put in by Bush in the United States and by Harper in Canada, and is expressly designed to keep the social relations intact. People use the language of ending homelessness, but it guarantees that it never will. And all levels of government have adopted this policy, which pathologizes people, it criminalizes people, and it causes devastation. The city of Toronto just put out its streets needs assessment, and chronically homeless, which is pathologizing. And it means that you're homeless for 6 months or more. And in under Housing First, you can't get supports until you're chronically homeless. So the number in Toronto of people from 2018 to 2020 chronic homeless has increased from half to 75%. And the city concluded it's going well, and we should just stay the course with chronic homeless, with Housing First, it's going well. And then blamed refugees for the increase in chronic homelessness, even though it's actually 1,500 real human beings. And so that's what electoral politics is doing. That's what the NDP is supporting. The NDP, which also has supported the attack of Indigenous people in Wet'suwet'en. The NDP is really just choosing a neoliberal poison, possibly slightly slower. It's the overthrow of capitalism that needs to happen. And there's no party right now that you can vote for that's going to make that happen. The only thing that's going to make that happen is people in the streets, and it's people fighting back. So if you want to join a struggle, that is great. But if you want to support systems that ensure the pathologization of people simply because they have nowhere to live, then great, go to Queen's Park. That's where you belong.
Thank you, AJ. I think your comments speak so powerfully to something that John actually mentioned in his bio, which is about OCAP being founded precisely to counter these politics of incremental mitigation. And it seems to me that countering the propaganda and the the demobilizing effects of mitigation lie at the heart of so many of our intertwined struggles that we're part of, whether it be resisting having a slightly more accountable but still brutal and lethal police and national security apparatus, or the incrementalism of adding, a few more shelter beds while simultaneously taking away many more. This countering the neoliberal propaganda of a philosophy of incremental mitigation lies at the heart of so many of our struggles, particularly now in a context of a pandemic, quote unquote, recovery, where we're seeing the retrenchment of a new normal, which looks very much like the old normal. But at the same time, we are also seeing the resurgence of the power of the language of abolition, which is perhaps the most powerful counter to the landscape we can imagine. Personal thoughts, what the horizons of liberation look like right now in this moment. What is it that you are most excited about that we are fighting for right now? Perhaps we can go Jennifer, John, and then finish with AJ.
So there are, any number of organizations in Toronto that do outreach that, have existing relationships with people living outside, living in parks, living across the shelter system. And they're talking to each other and they're organizing, together. And if there's a shortfall in one or they don't have the capacity to do something, another organization is picking that up. And that's like a really great thing, because that never used to happen. Everyone was very separate and it was, I know you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. And that's a really important aspect. And it's very intentional, the government tries to keep both like homeless people or people who are living in poverty and these organizations separate from each other. Because so much information that comes lost. But the more of us there are that are sharing our experiences about what works, what doesn't work, it's only helped for other people. And freedom of information that AJ has been responsible for doing, so much does come out. Like the city of Toronto is spending $6,600 a month per person per shelter hotel. I've been here over a year now. That would pay for like $1,500 a month, like almost 5 years rent. And the city's not changing anything. The government's not changing anything. People have to. They really do.
John?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, when OCAP got started in 1990, I mean, at the time, we thought we were up against something quite incredible in terms of the agenda of poverty and austerity and homelessness. But things are so much worse today. Things are so much more. Things have gone so much further, and we're in such a condition of crisis. And I'm not just talking about, social cutbacks and how many people in homeless shelters are. Those things are dreadful, but how this world now has been brought into a situation of enormous crisis at every level. Social crisis, an economic crisis, a climate and broader ecological crisis. And I think in the course of this, the point has come up, and AJ has made the point, is the politics of trying to mitigate things are just not going to get us anywhere. And OCAP, in a practical way, has set an example of how to be anti-capitalist.
I'm sorry, John, you're cutting out. We can't hear you. Maybe let's just pause while the siren. Yes.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry.
We can't miss any of your vital advice for how we save the world and build an actual livable future. So please.
AJ posed the question of what is actually posed is to overthrow capitalism, because the situation is not going to be changed by incremental improvements and mild reforms. That's really what it comes down to. And if that's going to happen, then there has to be political ideas put forward, unquestionably. But primarily it's going to be achieved, and people are going to learn the lessons necessary through struggling. And OCAP is one of many examples of how people have fought in serious ways to challenge this system. I think we're in a situation today where those kinds of lessons need to be taken into the struggles that lay ahead, not uncritically, and not to simply be applied in an uncritical way, to be adapted in all kinds of ways. But that's what this book provides us with. It provides us with a serious study of a serious struggle. And that's something at this moment is incredibly precious. And that is why I was so utterly thrilled to be part of this meeting tonight.
Thank you, John. AJ.
Yeah, thanks, John, and thank you, everyone. Something that Desmond said reminded me of how before 2008, anytime, John, probably this was his experience too, whenever we'd say the word capitalism in the media, they would just like be shocked. They couldn't comprehend what we were saying. And we couldn't name our economic system. We were somehow bizarro communists if we named the system.
Capitalism is kind of like Lord Voldemort.
Yeah.
Which cannot be named.
Yeah. And then 2008 happened, and with the Great Recession and the resistance that came, it could be named. And at that time, I could have never imagined that then the word abolition would come into the popular discourse and be actually a part of the discussion that is happening in the world. And it is so exciting to me that it is. And that in just like a real short period of time, how much has changed there. And that reconciliation is like a word that is something is on everyone's tongue. There's a real danger with both of those words in terms of them just being words and not having a lot of meaning, and the contradiction between what the Canadian state says and what it does is very apparent. And so I think there's so much possibility now, and there are so many connections that people are making between very many different deeply connected struggles. It's incredible. And that really, really excites me. And we need to make sure that our movement's language doesn't simply become institutionalized, that our movements become the foundation of the fabric of a new society. And I'm very excited for how we can rebuild that together.
That is such a beautiful note to end on from all three of you. Thank you so much. But do we have time for a PS? One more question from the YouTube chat. Fee is paying X amount to keep people in shelters. What if that amount went to people instead? So who wants to take on the role of being the alternative budgeteer for the state, and how, if that money for shelters was reallocated, what could it be doing?
So there's a really popular, like, that should just go to housing. And the problem with that is there has been money for housing allowances for a long time, and streets to homes, the capacity for them to house people has gone down and down every year. And the reason for that is because the housing allowances aren't enough. We're in a housing crisis. There's no housing. So there are people in shelter hotels. There are housing workers. They've only housed 8% of the people in those shelter hotels. They can't house everyone by any means, but they could actually house more people than they are. So simply saying we're going to give people rental subsidies doesn't solve the problem at all. And a lot of rental subsidies actually fucks with the market and can cause a lot of harm. So in individual circumstances, absolutely paying people's rent makes a lot of sense. But what we need is a lot of social housing. And the problem with Housing First, and one of the reasons that it's neoliberal, is it's a private market solution, and it only deals with a very small segment of the population. It takes the people that it thinks are the most expensive and pulls them and gives them support. We need mass amounts of social housing, and you can't take that out of the shelter system before you build the housing. So that money needs to come from the cops. We don't need to be fiddling with tiny, tiny shelter hotel budgets when there's more than $1 billion in the police budget, and that money is being used to harass and criminalize homeless people. And that's where that money can come from.
Thank you, AJ. Thank you to all of you. And thank you for this conversation and for the book, which does, correction from Fuzzcuz before we wind up. Meant what if it went to the residents themselves, the money?
Same thing. They don't have anywhere to go. Because we're in a housing crisis. Like maybe people could get housing, but there's still not enough housing for people. We need to like decommodify the private housing market and build social housing. So yeah, that's like there's lots of little things that seem like they could make sense, and it would, the shelter hotels, we need to preserve them. They're about to be evicted, and also they're terrible. Like both of those things exist, and Jennifer can say much more, and you should.
Jennifer, please.
Yeah. Just so for me, for instance, I've been on the waiting list for my current selections for 15 years. I need something that's wheelchair accessible, close to my medical supports. The only way for me to get housing in the city of Toronto is for someone else who's already in that housing to die, or for them to build it. Like those are the two options. And because they stopped building in the 90s, you know, the federal government used to pass on money, which trickled down, and they built like affordable units like every year. And the other is so the city of Toronto's version of affordable, like they just passed something for inclusionary zoning laws for what they call affordable is households that make between $31,000 or $30,000 and $90,000 a year. My current income on disability is $10,000 a year, and I'm not receiving the rent portion because I'm homeless. But once I am, they give me $6,000 a year, and it's going to for rent, and it's going to cost me about $1,600 a month for something that's accessible. So it's not there. They have to build it.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you for your questions and for your engagement. Thank you to AJ, Jennifer, and John for this beautiful and generative conversation that we've had tonight. Thank you to AJ for writing this wonderful book that does the work of making visible so many things that have to be rendered invisible in order for the current system to perpetuate itself. It makes visible not only a lot of the hidden work and labor that goes behind the changes and the activism that are the most visible face of social justice struggles, it also makes visible the hidden violence that lies behind so many of the states and systems' pretensions to benevolence and nonviolence. And it also makes visible the hidden crises and discomfort that are provoked in the state itself by struggles which we often, perhaps on the face of it, may think aren't making any impact, but are really producing much more trouble and perturbation that we may even be aware of at the time. Keeping all of these things invisible is vital to maintaining the status quo. So thank you for all the work you have done in ripping the veil off of these systems of invisibilization, giving us such a practical, useful, and as John said, exciting guide for how we build a future where words such as capitalism and colonialism not only become sayable, but actually relegable to the dustbin of history. Thank you, AJ. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to everyone who has joined us here tonight. Continue the struggle as we continue to fight to win, and hope to see you all soon. Bye.